I'm still John Hall, and it remains my honor to preside over this Society for Military History and this, our first ever virtual conference. My sincere thanks again to all of the people who made this possible, not least of all the presenters who shared their exciting work in this novel format. But I should like to thank again Dr. Mason Hayter and her team of behind-the-scenes Zoom producers, Guy Rossi, Haley Fenton, Rob Williams, and Paul McAllister. Thanks are also due to SMH grad student representative Jessica Sheets for organizing last night's graduate student roundtable and all of the graduate students who tuned in for that. Taken together, our presenters and producers and all of you who have participated in this virtual conference from around the world have advanced both our field and our ability to organize similar and perhaps larger events of this sort in the future. But first, it is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, who was to have delivered this address in Arlington, but was gracious enough to offer it in this medium and thereby to close out SMH 2020.5 with a flourish. It may well be that she needs no introduction, but I am so honored to share this virtual stage with her that I hope you won't mind indulging me. SMH regulars will know her as the most recent and most excellent past president of the Society for Military History. A much broader audience knows her as one of the world's leading experts on the American military experience in World War I. In addition to her star turn in the recent PBS American Experience series, The Great War, and her many essays and edited works on the subject, she has published 3 books on American involvement in the First World War. She has received numerous awards for her scholarship, including Fulbright Senior Scholar Awards to France and Australia, a Mellon Library of Congress Fellowship in International Studies, the Society for Military History's Best Prize for Best Military Reference Book, and the Jack Miller Center Prize for the Best Military or Diplomatic History Essay published in Historically Speaking. She is currently working on several projects related to the recently concluded centennial of World War I, an event which subjected her to the most grueling travel and speaking schedule one could imagine for 4 years and more. Just as it finally concluded and she was able to lay aside her duties as SMH president, she became a dean at her home institution, Chapman University. A glutton for punishment, she nevertheless accepted our invitation to deliver this year's keynote address, providing her an opportunity to share an expert's perspective on what historians of the Great War actually learn from the centennial commemoration of that conflict and what we lay people and generalists in turn should learn from them. So without further delay, Professor Jennifer Keene.
Thanks so much, John. Good evening, everybody. Such an honor and pleasure to have a chance to address all of you. Of course, this is normally the time in the conference when everybody's had a long 2 days, the bar is in the back waiting for you. And so you just hope that the keynote speak isn't too long so that you can continue to meet and greet and catch up with your colleagues. It's really unfortunate that we don't have an opportunity to do this in this pandemic moment, but I really do want to begin by thanking President John Hall, who of course is a dear friend, but also someone I worked closely with when I was president of the SMH, Vice President Pete Mansour, Executive Director C.C. Felkner, the entire SMH board and program committee for organizing this virtual conference and for inviting me to give this address. I really mean from the bottom of my heart, myself being in a leadership position during this pandemic is such a tough moment to be in any position of leadership. And I really want to thank all of these people for their heroic efforts during the pandemic to serve the society and its membership. For a lot of us, it's just hard to get through the day. And the fact that they've been nimble and thoughtful enough to really innovate and offer new opportunities to the entire membership, but particularly to our young scholars to be sure that their careers continue to progress. It's really a wonderful, wonderful thing that they're doing. And their selfless devotion and steadfastness is an example of it, exemplary leadership. I always said when I was president that we never can say thank you enough to the people who serve the society. And so I really do want to open up by sharing my thanks now as just a normal member of society for everything that they've done. So I was joking with John at the beginning as we were waiting for this webinar to start because I never wanted to give an address when I was done with my term as president of the SMH, and yet now he successfully manipulated me into, in fact, giving an address. So watch out, because John is very savvy and he will get you to do things that you didn't think you wanted to do. But kidding aside, I am actually pleased to have a chance to reflect on the centennial of the First World War. As John mentioned, for me, a lot of times in the midst of it, it was really hard to sit and reflect and think about what it all meant, because suddenly in this 4-year period, there was just a tremendous amount of public interest, scholarly interest, a lot of conferences, a lot of discussion. And, when you're in the whirlwind of things, it can be hard to really reflect and think, well, what is really new here? What is really progressing the scholarship or our understanding of the war? And so I was thankful after I got my head around it for this opportunity to do some reflecting myself and to think about something else besides COVID. So the question here is, in thinking about the role of these commemorations during the First World War, what did we learn that was new? What real difference does a centennial make in terms of thinking about how we understand this seminal event in world history? Now, I do want to acknowledge up front that I am very honored to be asked to do this, because there are many excellent and renowned historians within our membership who could indeed offer reflections on this topic. And in many respects, it's probably a topic better served for a roundtable than a keynote. So my comments are made, therefore, with the recognition that these are incomplete observations rather than a comprehensive encyclopedic listing of all the scholarships and centennial activities, excuse me, that the centennial generated. I'm not attempting an historic overview, and it's not going to be one of those kind of long, boring, I hope, addresses that goes over a lot of historiography and historiographic debates. Perennial debates that are always attached to the First World War continued during the centennial. The most important one, perhaps, is the origins of the war. Those were debates that were certainly reignited by new publications over whether the responsibility of the war was shared or could be laid at the doorstep of one nation, in particular, Germany. And this was just an example in which we saw longstanding conversations and debates invigorated over the course of the centennial, but still unresolved. And I would argue, in fact, the contours of those debates did not dramatically change. But instead, what I like to do today is focusing on some general patterns that I've seen emerging from the centennial moment, and how I think that has, in fact, reshaped the way that we understand the First World War. So I'm going to say a little bit about timing. And in a way, I'll start by noting the timing of this keynote, which is a kind of useful way for me to ease into my topic. Because the fact that I'm giving you this address in November, not last April, is a way that the SMH is playing around with traditional chronology. Fittingly, I will therefore be expanding the traditional time frame of 2014-2018, which is really known as the centennial moments, the years of the centennial, to examine key trends in scholarship over the last decade or so, which I think cumulatively have introduced this sort of new framing for how we understand the war that I want to address. Now, much of the scholarship was geared towards coinciding with centennial, but you all know, if you want something to come out in 2015 or 2016, you don't start writing it in 2013. So a lot of these projects were projects that had been long underway. People had shared their results earlier in conference papers and articles. And so we had a centennial moment, a kind of way of popularizing them. But we can't say that in these 4 years, suddenly people got to work and came up with books and projects that had taken a long time to bring to fruition. So I'm really looking at scholarship with patterns, I would say, that I see emerging over the last decade or so. Now, this messing around with chronology, do you give the keynote in November, April? Do you consider the centennial, a decade or just 4 years? This is actually this issue of chronology and this issue of timing leads to a really big first point that I want to make. When we teach history and when we talk to our students, especially as we begin to address interpretive paradigms, historiographic conversations, debates, the way that, in fact, there is a sort of slipperiness often to how we understand historical fact, You know from being in the classroom that your students, their heads roll back in their eyes. They're just so frustrated because they want certainty. And the one thing that we always try to give them, we say, okay, well, there's one thing that is certain, and what's certain are dates, names and dates. Those things are absolutely certain. So I'm here to say that one of the patterns that I really see coming out of this last decade or so of First World War scholarship is that in this most elemental of questions, where we mark the war's origins and where it ended, in fact, chronology is very unhelpful. These are now points of discussion and controversy. Our classic textbook assumption squarely dates the beginnings of the war with the July crisis and the guns of August, and the end with the armistice that took effect on November 11th, 1918. But this basic chronology, which seems the most obvious thing that we can all agree upon, is actually the thing that's been the most challenged over this last decade so of First World War scholarship. We've had new work that has expanded the temporal beginnings of the war to include the First and Second Balkan Wars. And these are wars that are reimagined now, not just as preconditions for the main event, but actually the first acts of violence in the conflict. When we mark the entry point of the US into the war, is it really April 1917 when Wilson asks for an official declaration of war, or is American involvement really better dated much earlier? That has also come into play. And the ending of the war is perhaps where we see the majority of the scholarship really moving the dates on us. Dates have definitely become a moving target. In the shatter zones of Eastern Europe, formerly under the control of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires, and large swaths of the Ottoman Empire, violence continued until 1923. And it wasn't until 1924 that the cycles of violence and revolution unleashed by the war were stabilized. So throughout Central and Southern Europe, with the defeat of Germany and the Russian Revolution playing out in the sort of whirlwind of existential violence, the sense that the war ends in November 1918 just doesn't make any sense. Now, this challenge to chronology is not just to nitpick and around the edges and sort of just to be pedantic, because it really goes to the heart of how we conceptualize the war. The traditional chronology fits well within a particular framing of the war. It's a framing that discusses the decisions of governmental leaders, official governmental policies, and it retains a laser-like focus on the Western Front as the primary theater of the war. And these challenges to traditional chronology are also challenging that traditional framing. And it's reflective, I think, of the new types of questions that were being asked during the centennial. And this is less a matter of claiming that traditional chronology is wrong and more pointing out the ways in which it is insufficient, because it narrows our gaze and causes us to tell the same story in essence again and again and again. And by pushing out the boundaries of the chronology, suddenly things that didn't seem so significant in the narrow framing become very significant. And it forces us in particular to broaden our gaze beyond the Western Front, to consider that the war in the East was not just different, but also more devastating. It asks us to consider that ending a war is harder than starting it. And probably the question that interests me the most in my own research, that what statesmen declare is often at odds with how that what statesmen declare is often at odds with how people experience war. So the challenges to traditional chronology have not just led to a broadening of what violence we identify with the global climate. It's also helped us think about some different ways of interacting on the global stage and some big patterns that, again, the narrowing chronology doesn't always give us enough reason to pay attention to. Here's a different example of how challenging the chronology changes our framing of the war. Our labeling of 1914 and 1917 as a period of neutrality for the United States underwent a rather profound transformation during the centennial. And this was fueled, really, I feel, most directly by new scholarship on wartime humanitarianism. And this new focus on humanitarianism endeavors reveals that indeed neutrality almost has become meaningless as a concept. It means something in terms of state level decision making, but in terms of what people are experiencing and how nations are interacting with each other, it's not very helpful, because it's very clear that for Americans during the war, especially when we look at humanitarianism, neutrality did not mean non-involvement. And calling the 1914 to 1917 period the period of neutrality really, again, obscures more than it illuminates. It obscures the multiple and diverse ways that Americans engaged directly in the war from its very beginnings. And as Wilson himself predicted in his 1914 neutrality address, when he announced the policy of neutrality for America, he said, and this is my favorite quote from this address because I think it's the most illuminating. It's not the being neutral in words as well as deeds. To me, it's this sentence: the effect of the war upon the United States will depend upon what American citizens say and do. And what Americans did is that they got involved in a massive, unprecedented scale in humanitarian endeavors and sent their money, goods, sometimes people, in order to help alleviate civilian suffering overseas, war-caused civilian suffering. And we can see a range of activities that fit into this: penny donations from school children, sacks of flour gifted by rural Kansas communities, aid workers going overseas, people sending money overseas to relatives who are now caught up in this maelstrom of refugees who are fleeing advancing armies. Through all of these individual acts taken collectively, millions of Americans helped give the United States an active humanitarian peace-building role in the war. And it was a role that fit well with the kind of official reason Wilson would give the nation when we entered officially in 1917. And Americans were also picking sides. Like American banks, the majority of American civilians sent their money to allied nations. And the food crisis in Germany, also something that introduced tremendous civilian suffering, barely registered among Americans. And having been spared from the war's deadly impact, Americans, in a sense, accepted their moral responsibility as global citizens to help others in need. And this fit well with the type of US leadership, kind of moral bent of US moral leadership that Wilson wanted the country to play from that point on. So perhaps the biggest takeaway from this refiguring of the chronological framing of the war is that it challenges us to appreciate what we add or drop from the narrative as we set the temporal limits of what we believe constitutes wartime. And here I think a lot of somebody like Mary Duziak's Wartime, where she challenges us in the 20th century to ever consider America truly a nation at peace. And I think that some of that thinking, that framing, by being applied globally to the First World War, also challenges us to move away from these notions that the beginning and the end point of the war is in fact crystal clear and connected to specific dates. Okay, so my second big takeaway from the centennial in terms of thinking about the scholarship, hang on. My second big takeaway is that the color of memory is no longer white. It's been duly noted that scholarship on the war contains more words written about British war poets than all the works on non-white troops put together. Yet, scholars have also noted that British war poets and white literate soldiers themselves wrote more words than non-white troops put together, both during and after the war. Post-war commemorative practices immediately after the war, besides the fact of this dearth of a first-person written record, also effectively helped erase the memory of sacrifice of many non-white participants. The Imperial War Graves Commission, for instance, elected not to individually memorialize the 200,000 porters, carriers, and soldiers who died in the East African campaigns and were buried in unmarked graves. And in sharp contrast to the desire to individually list the British war dead and on memorial plaques, grave sites, colonial authorities opted to place just general war memorials with the dead unnumbered and unnamed in the major cities to mark the sacrifice. And so we have, in a sense, two problems that had to be confronted. One was the question of sources, and the other was that the kind of handed down memory of what the war meant and whose sacrifice needed to be remembered was primarily a memory of white soldiers fighting. But the explosion of scholarship on the role and experiences of non-white peoples has really taken off during the centennial. And I think and probably is the biggest reframing of how we understand the conflict. And besides it just adding more knowledge to us, it really forces us to globalize our understanding of the war. We call it a world war, but in actuality, we study it mostly in terms of the experiences of individual nation states. But when you introduce serious conversation about non-white peoples, it really does require that you now think about the global conflict. Now, evaluating these experiences solely through the lens of official documents written by white elites can be problematic. But as the most plentiful and accessible documentation, you also can't throw them away. So we have this problem of sources. But because of the incredible creativity of the scholars working in this field, writing these stories has required, and they have demonstrated, creative use of using censored letters or petitions penned for the collective by the handful who were literate, family oral traditions, interviews, sound recordings, and photographs to supplement the official record. And this means now that we do have new scholarship on troops from India and West and North Africa who journeyed overseas, the soldiers, porters, and female camp workers who manned campaigns in East Africa, the role of Vietnamese and Chinese laborers, and African-American combatants and non-combatants. And I just want to underscore this point. Adding these stories to the narrative is not just a way of kind of like introducing a little more detail, a little more comprehensiveness, a little more flavor. This is scholarship that has set out new methodological pathways in terms of the source material and the framing of these works. And it also challenges the existing framing of the war from a different direction, not the chronological direction, but more in a sense from the geographical direction. This scholarship privileges a global approach, I've sort of said that already, but it also challenges the traditional core and periphery model that we've tended to adopt in the First World War, which, and by that what I mean is that we've had this tendency to, when we talk about nations or experiences of peoples outside of Europe, it's always in relation to it's always in connection to their relationship with Europe that we evaluate the importance of their participation or the meaning of their experience. But these are studies that try to break that core and periphery modeling for how we understand interaction or globalization during the war. And instead, by contextualizing the war in the socio-political, economic, non-European worldview, we get to better appreciate the variety of motivations for participating in the war and the expectations attached to the conflict. The global approach also allows scholars to focus on large-scale migrations that put the war into motion as the movement of men, goods, and ideas accelerated. The globalization of the world economy meant that millions of civilians worldwide felt the war's impact, even if they never actually left their home. And it also, this globalized view, shows us the broad circulation of Woodrow Wilson's ideas on the right to self-determination and how that inspired anti-colonial activists within Asia and the Middle East. And placed in this global context, Wilson changes to a certain extent. He appears less like, not changes in the sense less racist, never going to say that, but that's supposed to be funny, but it's hard to just be making a joke yourself sitting in your office. But placing this global conflict, Wilson appears less like an inept diplomat who failed to ensure permanent peace in Europe, and more as the intellectual who, perhaps unintentionally, encouraged anti-colonial independence movements to flourish. Now, we should ask ourselves to a certain extent, why suddenly this interest and this thriving scholarship on non-white people's participation in the war? And I have some ideas about why this is so, And a lot of it has to do with who we are and what we aspire to be and how we now see ourselves, and also how societies, especially European societies, society in Australia is constituted differently now. This broad gaze and more inclusive story thrives in part because European metropoles are much more diverse than they were in 1914, 1917, in the sense of who's permanently residing there. The post-World War II formation of strong diasporic communities in Europe intensified pressure to ensure that these community stories were included in wartime commemorations. You can't have a commemoration in Britain, for example, and not take into account the large role that Indian soldiers, especially Sikhs, played in terms of fighting for the British Empire. And these Sikhs who are now residing in Britain retain a strong interest in their forefathers' long history of military service to the British Empire. And participating in Armistice Day commemorations and during the entire centennial commemorations became a way for these communities to reconcile their ethnic, religious, and British identities. And we could give multiple examples of this. Our scholarly understanding of the war's reach and impact now encompasses the experiences of Chinese and Vietnamese laborers who traveled to Europe, women on the home front and battlefront, refugee experiences, and the experiences of minority populations in the military. The most important field in the American experience of the war, the most crowded field, the one where the most interesting work in many respects is being done, are these recent studies we've had on African American soldiers of the war, which has resulted in us really reinterpreting the war as a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. Work on women during the war has challenged the liberation through war work thesis, namely our desire to see war as offering women opportunities for economic and political advancement, by underscoring how much the belligerent nations depended on female labor and voluntarism to support male armies in the field, and how much policing of gender norms occurred to preserve the patriarchal family structure. And these scholarly works also reveal something else. They reveal to us just how much violence occurs within militaries. Violence is not just between armies, it's within armies. These are places where collisions between race, ethnicity, sexual violence, these are encounters between people ostensibly on the same side. And these struggles for equality and recognition now hold a permanent place in the scholarly historical narrative. And they offer us a different type of challenge, which is maybe one of the reasons I sort of was so petrified when John first asked me to give this address. Because I think that these studies show us that the real lesson from the centennial is that the experience was diverse, it was diffused. The idea of reassembling all these experiences into one sort of unified master narrative is probably not just impossible, it's not the right thing to do. That we need to, in fact, embrace the diversity and accept that one unified national or global narrative will never capture the diversity inherent in this wartime experience. So having said that, as a scholar, in terms of how I end the centennial, looking at the scholarship and thinking that it's just a basically impossible task to try to have one unified narrative, we turned to the moments of the matter of the commemorative moment itself, which is my third sort of area. The centennial itself was a distinct historical event where there was an attempt to craft numerous unified narratives and in terms of a nation commemorating this important event in world history. And so what do we make of it now that it's passed? How can we understand the centennial moment in terms of how well it reflected what was going on in the scholarly field, but also what difference did it make even in the public realm in terms of how people understand the First World War and think about its historical significance? So I always have a beef kind of with centennials because to me, just because the calendar says something happened 100 years ago, does that really mean it's the right moment for us to be thinking about it. It seems so arbitrary, right? So the calendar turns 100 and you're like, oh, okay, now suddenly the First World War is important. We should all be talking about it. Really? Maybe it's not. Maybe the most important time to talk about it is like 107 years after it started. But nope, Centennial is over. So now nobody wants to actually think about it anymore. So to me, I think we have to also just realize there's a kind of arbitrariness to this in terms of why we suddenly had this moment where we said that it was important. And so the first thing that necessitated was that convincing arguments did have to be developed about why at this moment this war needed to be remembered, and why the war mattered, and especially why the public, not just scholars, should care. And so this is then where we see the connection to centennials and commemoration that we all know. This is I'm not saying anything exceptionally profound here, that commemoration and remembrance are inherently political in nature. We can't remember everything and we need to be selective. So what, why, and how to remember these are not questions we answer in a vacuum. We always think about the concerns of the present as we think about how we want to commemorate some moments. I've already alluded to this a tiny bit by thinking about why emphasizing the diversity of the experiences becomes so important to us and how it connects to the composition of our societies and our aspirations for our societies in our own times. So the centennial therefore playing out in 2014 and 2018 necessarily reflected as much about our own times as it did about the state of play within World War I scholarship. And again, a kind of obvious example for many of you, I've been giving a lot of lectures about the influenza epidemic of 1918. And I mean, I think I'm on safe ground when I say that a year ago, I could have stopped 20 people on the street, and if one knew what the influenza epidemic of 1918 was, I would have been shocked. And now people not only know it happened, they know there were 3 waves, they know the second was the most important, they know that Philadelphia really messed it up. People have all sorts of knowledge, which is sort of astounding. And of course, it's connected to the COVID moment, and people having this idea that the past can somehow predict the future, right? The predictive insight of these details gave people a kind of semblance of control as the COVID pandemic began. And I remember my university asked me to give a talk. I don't know, 700 people showed up on Zoom, Teams actually. So I gave this talk, and then afterwards, this was in April. And a bunch of people who said to me, oh, I'm so glad you gave that talk because now I know there's going to be a second wave, as if like my telling them what happened in the past actually was going to predict the future. So it's kind of interesting way of why we actually interact with history. But the memory landscape for the war, I mean, we're all sort of in the COVID moment together, but when it came to really the centennial moment and how we thought about the First World War and how did we answer this question about like, why now should we actually be thinking about this war as being something important? We see that the war played out differently in different national settings. And while the war was commemorated globally, in the end, those commemorations did not dramatically change the relative importance granted to the war in national narratives. The war has always figured more prominently in the historical imaginations of Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and France, and much less prominently in the historical narratives of Germany and the United States, both before, during, and after the centennial. Russia's memory of this period is still dominated by the 1917 October Russian Revolution, and Turkey actively suppresses any commemoration or mention of the Armenian genocide and focuses instead on the victory of martyrs at Gallipoli, with again almost no mention of their loss in the war. And so the centennial in some respects underscored what was already known to World War I scholars, and that was the enormous divide between countries where remembrance of World War I occupies a central place in the national commemorative culture, and those that have carved out just a minimal place for the war in their national story. And whether the place of the war was strong or weak, prevailing national narratives mostly persisted, even as I've said, scholars' understandings of the war have changed. And so let's give a few examples about this. So let's consider Gallipoli, which is one. Every Australian school child makes a pilgrimage to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra to learn about Gallipoli, where the Anzac legend was born, which is that sense of Australian national identity, being born in Gallipoli, which gives Australia its sense of exceptionalism, and an exceptionalism that's really based on white male masculinity and this heroism on the battlefield. And while it's true that Anzac in Australia has now developed a more expansive meaning, not just associated with military service, but really associated with anyone who performs selfless service to the nation, it still remains this idea of Australian nationalism that is a primarily white memory. And it has proved resilient even as the population of Australia becomes more diverse ethnically and racially. But the myth itself, and scholars have written tons of books challenging the Anzac identity, myth, why do we have this, poked all sorts of holes in it, but still on Anzac Day, that's the memory that the public embraces. It also means that there are some things that can't be spoken about. Retaining Turkish permission to visit the battlefields at Gallipoli, which is a rite of passage for many young Australians, does in fact require playing down the Armenian genocide, certainly by the government. And then we can look at it from a different perspective. Like, the French public could care less about Gallipoli, even though more French died there than Australian soldiers did. And in commemorating their victory at Gallipoli, the Turks never really focus on the land battles. They focus on stopping the British Navy from entering the Straits, pegging it as a glorious defeat of the world's leading naval power. And so here we have probably one of the most international battles of the war, but still we can see that national rather than transnational narratives prevail. And that didn't change during the centennial. So in France, another place where the war holds a central place in the historical memory, the memory of the war focuses on the poilu, which is the slang term for French soldier, which translates literally as hairy one. And if you've ever seen photographs of French soldiers in the First World War, big beards, you understand where that term comes from. So the poilu remains at the center of wartime commemoration in France, in part because the image allows descendants of France's 8 million wartime troops some elasticity in how the war is remembered. Because the poilu, it turns out, is not really a fixed figure. As I pointed out with the Anzac legend, there's been a little bit of expansion in that, but the poilu, it really has even more elasticity in terms of how you actually understand what happens during the war. The poilu can be seen alternately as a hero who saved France, cannon fodder, a secret pacifist, an anti-authoritarian figure who exemplifies the true heart of the French Republic, especially people who focus on the mutinies, or some combination of above. In ensuring the success of the European Union project during turbulent times against the backdrop of Brexit and America's pulling back from Europe, you could see that emphasizing the poilu became also a rather apolitical way to be commemorating the war. France was concerned about using the commemorations to keep unity within the country, but also keep unity within Europe. And so France was probably the most aggressive in the commemorations in terms of reaching out and trying to strengthen a trend towards transnational commemorations on the battlefield. So we saw a lot of this, initiated in the 1960s, actually, to use the war's anniversaries to reinforce a French-German rapprochement friendship, and became really common. It became very common during the centennial, and it kind of built on a trend that had been firmly established in 1984, when we had Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl hold hands before the Douaumont ossuary at Verdun. A real sense that the unified grieving over the senselessness and futility of death in the war could actually help Europe heal and come back together. And so the French government did this during the centennial, and we saw them organizing joint French-German, French-British, French-American ceremonies to mark key battles and moments in the war throughout the centennial. And you can see that, again, this didn't happen in a political vacuum. It happened very much against the backdrop of Britain voting to leave the EU, the United States with a new administration pulling back on its traditional commitments to Europe, and this sense that the importance of underscoring traditional alliances, but also the importance of France and Germany at the heart of the European Union, that these needed to be reinforced during the centennial. So even though obviously France and Germany fought the war against each other, it wasn't an attempt to really investigate the origins of the war, the way that the war was fought, or lingering discord at the end of the armistice and the end of the peace treaties. So we see how the political moment really came into play here. I do want to contrast this state of affairs on the public commemorative realm in Europe with what scholars were doing in Europe. Because the third really wonderful scholarly thing that I think came out of the centennial, besides challenging traditional chronology, besides having us put once and for all aside the notion that the memory of the war is white, was the creation of something known as the 1914-1918 online International Encyclopedia of the First World War. Now, I was involved in this project, but I'm not trying to claim it was great because I was involved, because I got jumped on after other people got the idea underway. But what this is that this is a peer-reviewed open access encyclopedia that involved a cooperation from at least 1,000 academics throughout the world, asking them to write essays, peer review essays, to facilitate an international scholarly dialogue about across linguistic barriers. So they paid for translations. It is an English language source, but it really used our technology and the funding that they received from the German government to really facilitate conversations across scholars, among scholars that never were had before. There's no way, if you don't read Italian, to access the Italian conversation and the rich scholarship on Italy's experiences during the war. I mean, I could say this for 50 more nations here. And here you had an opportunity for people to really come into conversation with each other. And this is lasting. This isn't an ephemeral thing that you have a conference, maybe a few essays get put in the book, but for the most part, it sort of disappears as soon as the moment's passed. This is open access. It's you can look at it now. It's to me a great way of how you can really not just say you want to globalize your understanding of the war by looking around at different places, but you can access the rich scholarship that has been produced in other nations in a way that helps you reframe and challenge some of the assumptions you've made about the war. And so this endeavor to me is just the beginning of a kind of rich possibility we'll see, not just of transnational studies within Europe, but of a real globalizing in terms of our understanding of the war. And so to this, I think is a real legacy of the war that we'll actually see. Now, this was a project that was sponsored, as I said, by German academics and German funding, which really did not have a lot to do with how Germany itself, in its public commemorations, was thinking about the war. In Germany, the outpouring of interest focused less on the suffering of soldiers or even civilians and more on the question of war guilt. And I've tried really hard not to mention individual publications for the war, because that's always going to make somebody annoyed that you left out something super important that they've written. But I do have to mention at least one, and that is the publication of Christopher Clark's work, The Sleepwalkers, because this really was a sort of phenomenon in Germany. And this is a book that argues that the responsibility for the war was shared across European capitals. And it became a media phenomenon in Germany, in part because it allowed for a more positive view of modern German history, because it did not, in fact, it rejected scholarly interpretations that assigned primary guilt to Germany for having started the war. And the perceived need here, so for Germany, the real focus in terms of the commemorations was on the question of origins, because this is a lingering question. It goes directly to the sense of German self-identity. And then we did, of course, see some commemorations, as I mentioned, in terms of joint ceremonies with Britain and France to mark the centennial. But for the most part, we see in Germany that it wasn't the First World War is not a major event. The Second World War by far overshadows the historical memory, and that did not dramatically change as a result of the centennial. So what about Britain? Because Britain is indeed a place where the popular narrative is very strong about the First World War. We can really say that about many parts of the British Empire here. And in Britain, the popular narrative tends towards viewing the war as a futile waste of life, a needless war in which lions were led by donkeys. This viewpoint is perfectly encapsulated by a 1989 television show, Blackadder Goes Forth. Probably lots of you have actually seen this. If you haven't, I definitely suggest you take a look. Still very popular, in which the leading character, Blackadder, outsmarts in several episodes the idiotic, pompous generals orchestrating the war, but nonetheless ends up dying as he goes over the top in yet another senseless assault in the final episode. Now, this public conception of the kind of heartless generals who mindlessly sent men to mass deaths is really at odds with British scholarship on the war. In contrast, British scholars have increasingly argued that the war was necessary, it wasn't futile, it was necessary to stop an expansionist Germany, and that British generals should be remembered not as murderous fools, but as heroic leaders who adapted and learned and secured victory in 1918 for the Allies. And this in Britain was a question, and I think it was a question in the US as well, and the question is, was the centennial a moment to commemorate not just sacrifice, but victory? Now in Britain, one of the most popular commemorative projects was the installation of 888,264, to make sure I get that number right, ceramic poppies installed in the moat of the Tower of London. And if you have had a chance, if you've ever had a chance to see it in person or the pictures of it, you know that the poppies were arranged in it. So it sort of looked like a waterfall coming down from the Tower of London moat into the moat itself, and sort of looked like a flow of lava or a flow of blood, really, in terms of, and the individual poppies that were placed there. And each poppy was meant to represent a British military life lost in the war. And these were lives that included lives lost, military lives lost from the British Empire. And this art installation was dramatic. 5 million people went to see it, but it did imagine the war as a distinctly British tragedy. The focus was on male military losses, which also promoted a rather traditional narrative of whose sacrifices we remember. There were no poppies, for example, for female workers who were poisoned or the victim of explosions while they worked in munitions factories. And immensely popular, the exhibit reinforced rather than challenged traditional understandings of the war in Britain. So the scholar side of me, kind of critical of the art exhibit, but the personal side of me, well, I have a poppy. I got one. You could buy one. My family gifted it to me, and they gifted it to me in memory of a great uncle who at 18 years old was killed in the Battle of Arras, the first engagement he ever participated in. And this, I think, is where we see the conflict, right? The kind of intellectualized, scholarly view of what should be remembered, how we think about it, but then the way in which people visit these art installations, and in countries with strong memories of the First World War, that these become, in a sense, sites of pilgrimages, where people are going not really to learn anything new, they're going to remember their personal story and the way that it connects to their families. And that will always be a tension in terms of thinking about what commemorations mean and what centennials mean, and how do you understand that personal emotive experience that people have had over the course of the centennial versus the new books that we put on our shelves. Now, other types of commemorative activities occurred in Britain, and there was a lot of diversity in terms of the community level projects. I think I've already explained, why I believe, in fact, that because that reflects changing composition of contemporary British society. So we did see projects about Chinese laborers, Belgian refugees, women, certainly in Ireland, thinking about the ways in which the war and the centennial intersect with remembrance of the Easter Rebellion in 1916. But in all of these in Britain, a lot like in France, the theme of tragic loss remains central, in part because it remains the least controversial way to remember the war. So this brings me to the United States, again, a country with very little memory of the war, real opinions in the public consciousness about what the war meant. It's kind of a trope to say that World War I has been a forgotten war. I think it has been. We never really developed a collective memory about what the war was to us. We have, World War II, the good war. We think of the Cold War as a survival against a communist foe. Vietnam, while controversial, we still do have a sense, at least, of it as a controversial, perhaps unpopular war. But World War I doesn't really have that kind of go-to meaning for many Americans. Yet, at the same time, and this was something that the centennial revealed, immediately after the First World War, people in the United States did believe that they had lived through a pivotal historic event in world history. And they did commemorate their participation in that event. And I'm not talking about our rejection of the Versailles Peace Treaty. I'm talking about the ways in which people looked at their physical environment and actually began to erect many types of structures to memorialize the war. So we have statues, plaques, parks, playing field, buildings. And then in 1921, the remains of an unidentified soldier were buried in the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington Cemetery. And this was new. This was a brand new commemorative practice. This is a time when no wars had national monuments in Washington, D.C. And the creation of a national site of mourning and remembrance explicitly for World War I was really a way that, in a sense, elevated that war in the public consciousness as perhaps the most important world event that the United States had been party to up until that point. But almost immediately after the erection of the tomb of the unknown soldier, Americans differed in what they believed that structure actually meant. And really along the same lines as I've been suggesting, other nations struggle with. Are you representing sacrifice? Are you representing valor? Are you representing peace? Are you representing victory? And these were things that Americans did not agree upon. African American civil rights activists adopted the trope of the unknown soldier to highlight the nation's refusal to adequately recognize the contributions of Black soldiers. And town monuments also reflected this ambiguity over whether the nation was commemorating victory or mourning loss in the statues they erected with plaques listing the community's war dead. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but suffice it to say, we just had Veterans Day, which November 11th, Armistice Day. It's a day where a lot of people ask, how come it's Veterans Day? Why do we call it that instead of Armistice Day, as other nations do? And I think that in a way it's emblematic. So Armistice Day becomes Veterans Day in 1954 when it becomes a holiday to honor all living and deceased members of the armed forces, really losing its distinctive connection to the First World War. Now that hasn't happened in other nations. Armistice Day is still is still a pretty unique moment. But for us, it shows how the war has really become absorbed into a different narrative, sort of part of the general story of the 20th century in which America becomes a leading world power. And when we think about how America really understood the commemoration, we could see that it really did, in many respects, reinforce our idea that the 20th century was the American century, and the First World War is the opening act of America stepping out onto the world stage, assuming its rightful place of leadership, even in a somewhat halting, hesitating way, but it was predictive of the way that America would exercise its power moving forward. There was also an opportunity during the centennial to think about different answers to this question about why should we care about this war now? And we did see, if we think about that moment, this is a moment when we're still smarting under flawed military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, instability in the Middle East, worries that the American century had ended, and concerns about civil liberties during an endless domestic war and terror. And we saw in the popular press lots of articles and reflections every time there was some moment to commemorate in the First World War, parallels to what does this say about our society today and what we should be doing either internally or externally. So this idea of always trying to make the history relevant to us in our contemporary day concerns was an exercise the nation went through because it seemed necessary in order to justify remembering the war at all. Not remembering just the war on its own terms. We're always, in a sense, saying, what's in it for us? What do we get out of actually remembering? But at the same time, I will, just as I sort of looked at Europe and then kind of swung over to 1914, 1918 online as something really significant, I think came out of the centennial that will outlast the moment and really be an amazing resource for scholars in the future. I would say that the same thing happens in the United States in terms of laying a foundation for a scholarly renaissance in studies of the First World War, especially of the American experience. The lectures, exhibits, and conferences organized by libraries, museums, and universities throughout the United States did leave a footprint. Many archives took advantage of the sudden availability of funds to fully inventory and sometimes even digitize their World War I holdings. The Library of Congress, for example, crafted a major exhibit, Echoes of the Great War, the American Experiences of the First World War, which was a great exhibit, but it's gone. But what's not gone is that they used the moment of the centennial to do detailed summaries and inventories of their World War I collections and new online resources that now include sheet music, photographs, maps, and manuscripts. And similarly, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts mounted a comprehensive art exhibit, World War I and American Art, that offered a major interpretation by challenging the traditional assumption that American artists barely noticed the conflict. And equally important, and this is where maybe my experience with the poppy and how it meant something to me because of this family connection, nearly every public event prompted yet another American to delve into personal family history. And the material uncovered often found its way into the public domain through privately published letter collections or as donations to local libraries and archives. And the sudden sense that participation in the war was an important historical experience worth of remembrance imbued these letters and artifacts with new value to both families and professional archivists. And this matters because we need the sources to be able to tell the stories. And the fact that the centennial has resulted in sort of a new awareness, inventorying, accessibility of materials on the First World War is going to be yet another lasting impact of the centennial. We saw this happen as well from the National Endowment of Humanities, which helped towns through its funding rediscover how much World War I had infused their own cultural landscape. We saw the art historian Mark Levitch, who initiated the World War I Memorial Inventory Project, and successfully relied on crowdsourcing to create a database of local monuments and memorials. So suddenly, if you opened your eyes and walked around, you realized World War I was all around you, and so it helped people, in fact, see a history that was right there. Here. So the unearthing of these long forgotten or overlooked archival collections and making materials widely available through digitization, this is going to make new scholarship likely and possible. So in conclusion, I'm sure you've been waiting for that one. This is my final comments, and this I am directing to any graduate students that are watching, or any advisors of graduate students that are watching, or anybody who's interested in a new area of research, or for the World War I specialists out there who probably already know, what I'm talking about already. Thanks to the centennial, rather than having exhausted the topic of World War I as a field of study, now is perhaps the best possible time to delve into a project about the war. We did learn a lot about the war during the centennial, but I think the most important thing is that thanks to the centennial, we're about to learn a lot more. Thanks so much for inviting me to give this address. It's really been an honor to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was just fantastic. And this is one of those awkward moments in the Zoom format where there's no auditorium full of people to applaud you. But I'm sure everybody that's virtually watching right now is going to join me. And I do see the hand wave from a number of the participants as well as a virtual clap. So thank you very much. We do have time for a few questions, and I'll use my prerogative as a host and moderator as such to ask the first one. You really anticipated just about every question that I thought I was going to want to ask. And the one has to do with World War II overshadowing World War I in the United States. And of course it does, and it has, and it probably will for a long time. But do you find that the shadow is getting fainter as it gets longer, and that maybe now there is a greater interest in the United States for what is over that massive hill in retrospect, and that there's a curiosity about World War I, because for so long our historical hindsight could not get over that massive element of the national story that was World War II. And in the same vein, that the lack of a national narrative engenders a genuine curiosity, which in an American context might in some way close that breach that is so common in these other nations, where there's a scholarly desire to change the narrative, to learn new things, and a stubborn national narrative, and maybe even a resentment of new interpretations to something that resonates so much with national meaning. So you touched on both of these, so I was wondering if you could briefly respond to my hypothesis, or hope, as it were, that shadow of World War II is becoming a little less powerful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that, I guess my preferred approach to this kind of topic is not to see it as a zero-sum game. So not to see it as, in order to pay more attention to World War I, we have to pay less attention to World War II. It seems to me that when we want to start putting ourselves back into the shoes of the people who, sort of looking forward as they went forward, World War I obviously loomed large in the both lived experience and historical imaginations of the people who participated in the Second World War. So for somebody in the Second World War to think, oh, the First World War doesn't matter anymore, it wouldn't even make any sense, because of course it did. So I think the sense is to maybe not always be privileging what's important about either what has the biggest numbers, right? So it's always like, oh, well, more people died in World War II than World War I. America, suffered, was in longer. And, these kinds of comparisons that sort of, I think that they start obscuring actually what the real story is. And so even the unifying narrative that we have about the good war, well, every scholar knows no can pop a pin in that bubble immediately. I mean, let's talk about let's talk about race. Let's talk about Japanese Americans. Let's talk about, I mean, we could talk about a ton of things that are going to challenge that that idea, but as it serves a political purpose, it becomes reinforced, in our national discourse. One of the things that I thought, I'm sort of not really answering your question because it's hard. I'm not trying to, I don't know that it's a good thing if we do less study of World War II and, in order for us to do more study of World War I guess was what I'm really saying. What I also think is interesting is how um, the idea of the liberal international order being established by World War II and that being a beneficial thing that because it's kept peace and it in the sense of in Europe at least, and it has been a beneficial thing that being challenged in the last few years has also driven people back to World War I because understanding Wilsonianism and the sort of early origins of that idea has kind of made it, I think, from a periodization point of view, hard to only look at World War II to understand the kind of international world order in which we live. Does that make sense? So in a sense, that I felt was a kind of positive way because nobody was going to deny the importance of World War II establishing that order, but the idea that you had to go back to World War I, otherwise you couldn't understand it. And I think a similar things happened with civil rights movement. Nobody's going to deny that the generation after World War II was formative in terms of many successes in the modern civil rights movement. But now people know you can't understand that activism and the success without going back to World War I and understanding what happened there. So to me, these become ways, again, of the traditional chronology expanding, and we understand more. And it's not a matter of arguing which war deserves more importance. That if you really do have to take this kind of 100-year century view to understand the trends and the patterns and what you see, and you like the good feel good story, right? Defeat Nazis, end segregation, all the feel good moments we have later on. Well, those don't come without you understanding an earlier period. Sorry, John, we got so far into this without my saying you're muted, but now I have to say it. You're muted.
I'm muted. I am muted, but no longer. We have just a couple of other questions. I'm going to take them in the order in which they came in. And so the first other question is from the current vice president of SMH, Pete Mansour, who asks, did the centennial shed any more light on the contribution of the BEF in defeating the German army in France during the 100 Days campaign in 1918?
Well, yes, I think that it did. I mean, I think that the idea that the campaign was decisive and that actually was a moment. I was trying not to get too far in the weeds, but I think that was a moment where scholarship that had been done in the last 100 days, as you came to those moments in the centennial and had to mark them, this became a way to kind of share more broadly that scholarship and really help people appreciate that just that this was this kind of definitive moment here. Probably where it maybe fell down in the public consciousness is it got a little bit into the argument over which country deserves credit for the victory, and there are British scholars who argue really strongly that Britain deserves the primary critic, and you have American scholars who argue America deserves the primary responsibility. But I think that scholarship probably the real advancement of it was to reinforce the notion that this is really a coalition victory and has to be understood that way. So I'm not an expert on British military history, but to me that scholarship, it was diffused more widely, and in that sense, I think it's a kind of way to understand the final phases of the war that maybe most people did not really embrace before the centennial.
Thank you for that. One other question, and if you have not yet posed a question, you'd like to get one in, this is the last call for that. The one other question that has been posed comes to us from Sam Watson from U.S. Military Academy, who
Hey, Sam.
asks, do you think that Brexit has increased the distance between the current British scholarship and popular memory? Brexit would seem contrary to the globalization and de-whitening of scholarship.
Yeah, so I think that this was one of the reasons why, when I was talking about, where's your safe space to actually talk about, so you don't create internal discord about how you talk about the war, that the language of sacrifice becomes this kind of unifying language. Everybody's going to mourn sacrifice and deaths. But whether or not you believe those deaths were futile, or you're saying those deaths were necessary to secure victory, that's where you can start having discord. And some of with Brexit, which is also heightened nationalistic rhetoric within Britain, and the sense that this was a glorious national victory for Britain, that it should be the victory and the sense of worthwhile sacrifice that should be really highlighted here. That's where you could see maybe the discord between scholars, because even people who were arguing this was a great victory, do they necessarily want it to be in service of the Brexit moment or the Conservative Party in Britain? And so here it's where politics and politicians are going to embrace interpretations of the past that also speak to their supporters and where they are now. So you have that in Britain, but also think about in the United States. Make America Great Again is an idea that harkens back, harkens back to this notion of when we were great, when we were world power, when we were dominant. And there were ways that the commemoration / celebration of the American contribution to the victory on the Allied side was also used to bolster that view of American exceptionalism and America saved the Allies and America deserves the credit. And that was not just a kind of scholarly abstraction. This was something that was connected to political rhetoric and discourse at the time. So I think you saw a similar thing going on in Britain. And where do you walk that line? So that's where I think it definitely had an impact.
Well, Jennifer, that was our last question. So let me conclude by saying how very glad I am that I coerced you into giving this keynote address this evening. It was everything that I could have hoped for and more, and I'm sure that I am not alone in that sentiment. So thank you very, very much. And to all of you who have participated in SMH 2020.5, policy and conference by other means, let me thank you on behalf of all of the officers of the SMH and all of the people who worked to put this conference on. We do appreciate that you took the time to spend a large portion of your Friday and Saturday with us. I think everybody who participated will agree that this has been a worthwhile endeavor, and we are going to do more things like this, most likely, in the future. We do look forward to seeing you in Norfolk in May for SMH 2021. And as I said yesterday in the introduction, that meeting will go on, whether it is 100% in Norfolk or some hybrid format using Zoom or another medium. We will have an annual meeting in late May. So please do get your proposals into the program committee. I look forward to seeing you there. And again, thank you all and good night here from Tampa.